Arizona Territory, spring of 1878. The sun was still bleeding into the desert horizon when the wagon rolled into the ranch yard, its wheels groaning under the weight of silence. Zadie Greenwood sat stiff on the bench seat, her hands folded neat in her lap like she had been taught. Her stepfather, Clyde Mercer, didn't speak. He never did much unless it was to correct her. He had taken her in after her mother passed last year, married too quick and drank even quicker. And now, after one too many debts and one too many beatings, he had traded her silence for a roof, left her here at the Rossing Ranch like a sack of grain. She does not speak at supper, Clyde said flat. She keeps quiet. She earns her keep. Then he left, without looking back. Zadie stood there, 17 3/4 years behind her, and the weight of 18 pressing heavy on her shoulders. Inside the main house, the supper table was long, rough-hewn, and already set for the hands. She was told to sit at the end, near the kitchen door. She obeyed. The cook, a stern woman named Myra, passed her a plate and said nothing else. The ranch hands came in, stomping dust and hanging their hats. Most ignored her. One did not. He was the last through the door, tall, sun-browned, with hair the color of dry pine bark and eyes like the sky before a storm. His name was Lawson Reed. He nodded to the others, then sat 2 seats down from her. Zadie kept her eyes low. She was told not to speak. But when Myra asked if she wanted beans or stew, Zadie hesitated, then quietly answered, "Stew, please." Every fork paused. Heads turned. Lawson did not. He looked right at her, then not in judgment. Just looked, like he had been waiting for her to say something. His gaze held her for a moment too long before he turned back to his plate. And then he smiled, just once, down at his stew. Zadie did not sleep well that night. The bunk behind the kitchen was small and warm, crowded with the smells of grease and soap. But mostly it was her thoughts that kept her awake about the cowboy who looked at her like she mattered. The next morning, she swept the dining hall before sunrise, then helped Myra with bread. By noon, she was scrubbing tack in the barn when she heard boots behind her. "You always this quiet?" Lawson's voice was low, calm. Zadie straightened. "I am not supposed to talk. Supper's over." She turned. He leaned against a post, arms folded, watching her like he meant to understand her. "I heard what Clyde said," he added. "That does not mean I agree." She wiped her hands on her apron. "You do not even know me." He smiled again, softer this time. "Not yet." From then on, it was like that. He never pushed, but he always noticed. When she carried too much firewood, he took half without asking. When the hens pecked her arms bloody, he fixed the coop. He did not say much, not in front of the others. But outside, where the prairie wind could carry secrets, he spoke gently and listened better. One evening, about 2 weeks in, the ranch held a Sunday supper. Roast pork, sweet potatoes, cornbread. Zadie sat at the end again. She did not speak. But halfway through, Myra asked if she liked the food. Zadie nodded, then whispered, "Yes, ma'am." And once again, Lawson looked her way. Not just looked, turned full toward her, his expression soft, like she was the only one at the table. After the meal, when the others moved to the porch, Lawson lingered near her. "You do not have to keep quiet for my sake," he said. "I do not know what I would say. Start with your name." "Zadie Greenwood." "Lawson Reed." She smiled, just a little. "I know." That night, she watched the sky from the bunkhouse stoop, her bare feet on warm stone. Lawson passed by with a lantern, headed toward the stable. "Good night, Zadie," he said, and it was the first time anyone had said her name in weeks. "Good night, Lawson." She said it quiet, but he heard. The next morning, a rider came hard into the yard, a man from a neighboring ranch, wild-eyed and shouting. There had been trouble near the pass. A wagon had overturned. A woman and 2 children were stranded. Without waiting, Lawson mounted up and told the foreman he was going. Zadie stood by the fence, heart pounding. Lawson caught her eye before riding out. "Keep the coffee hot," he said. "I will be back by dark." He was not. The sun dipped low, and Zadie paced the kitchen, wringing her hands until Myra told her to sit down before she wore a hole in the floor. Then hooves. Then shouting. Then Lawson's voice. Zadie ran to the porch. He came through the dusk with blood on his sleeve, dust in his hair, and a little girl clinging to his back. A boy, maybe 6, held his stirrup like a lifeline. Behind them, the woman, pale, shaken, and limping road doubled up on another horse, led by a ranch hand. Zadie stepped forward without thinking. Lawson slid down and handed the girl to her. "Name's Kira," he said. "Her brother's Caleb. Their ma is Ruth." Zadie gathered the girl close. "I will take her." Later, when the children were fed and Ruth was resting, Zadie found Lawson in the barn, wiping blood from his arm. "You could have been killed," she said. He looked up. "So could they. You did not even hesitate." He shrugged. "Neither would you." She stepped closer. "You scare me. I would never hurt you." "I know." He took her hand then, slow and careful. "You are not the quiet girl Clyde tried to turn you into. I see you, Zadie." She blinked hard, throat tight. "I do not know how to be anything else." "You do. You already are." He leaned in, just enough that his forehead touched hers. No rush, no demand, just warmth. And for the first time in a long while, Zadie felt like she belonged. Not because someone told her she did, but because someone had seen her, really seen her, and chosen her anyway. That night, she sat at supper and spoke freely. Not loud, just enough. And every time she did, Lawson looked her way like he always had. The first heat of summer rolled in slow, settling over the Rossing ranch like a heavy wool blanket. By mid-June, the creek behind the west pasture had thinned to a trickle, and dust curled up from every hoof step. Workdays stretched longer with the light, and the men grew quieter with their labor. Zadie spent most of her daylight hours in the wash-house or mending feed sacks in the shade of the storage shed. She no longer flinched when spoken to, though she still kept her words measured. Her voice wasn't something she gave freely only where it was earned. Lawson found reasons to pass by. A saddle that needed checking. A loose hinge on the gate. He never lingered without something in his hands, but he always left with more than he came for, usually a few words from her, sometimes a glance she didn't mean to give. One evening, after the cattle had been driven in ahead of a looming storm, Zadie sat beneath the eaves of the barn, patching a tear in Myra's apron. The wind picked up, and the first drops of rain hit the dust like scattered seeds. Lawson stepped out from the tack room, his sleeves rolled and damp at the cuffs. "You staying dry out here?" "I'm fine," she answered, threading her needle again. He stood a pace away, watching the clouds gather. "Storm will break hard. You ought to come in." "I'm not afraid of rain." He knelt beside her, one knee in the mud. "No, I don't reckon you're afraid of much." She didn't answer, just knotted the thread and bit it clean. Lawson nudged a small tin over to her. Inside were 4 pieces of hard candy, wrapped in waxed paper. "Got these in town last week. Meant to give 'em to Ruth's kids, but they've been spoiled enough lately." Zadie stared at the tin, then at him. "Why me?" He shrugged. "You haven't had anything sweet since you came here. Figured you might like to be thought of." She took one, careful not to touch his fingers. "Thank you." They sat in quiet as the rain came harder, drumming on the roof. A low rumble rolled across the hills, and a flash of lightning turned the yard silver. Zadie shifted the apron onto her lap. "Did you grow up around here?" Lawson leaned back against the barn wall, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Montana territory. My folks ranched near the Bitterroot Valley. Cattle and hay. Winters were long." "Why'd you leave?" He picked at a splinter in his palm. "My older brother took the place after Pa passed. I wasn't needed." She nodded slowly. "I understand that." He glanced over. "I think you understand more than most." The rain softened to a steady whisper, and the air smelled of wet earth and horses. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Sometimes. But I like it here. The work's honest. The people, mostly decent." Zadie folded the apron and set it aside. "You don't talk like most men. Maybe I listen more." That made her smile, just a little. "That's rare." He turned to face her fully. "You ever think about leaving?" She looked out at the soaked yard, the fence line blurred with rain. "Not lately." Lawson reached into his coat and pulled out a folded scrap of paper. "I've been drawing up plans. Thought about asking Mr. Rossing if he'd let me lease the North Ridge. Build a small place of my own." Zadie's eyes narrowed slightly. "You want to leave the bunkhouse?" "Eventually. I've had my fill of sharing space with men who don't wash proper." She laughed a real sound, short and surprised, and covered her mouth too late. Lawson didn't tease her for it. He just watched her, a warmth behind his eyes that didn't ask for anything in return. "You'd build it alone?" she asked, quieter now. "I'd like to build it with someone. Someone who wants the same kind of quiet I do." Zadie's hands curled around the tin. I might know that kind of quiet. He nodded, slow. I thought you might. The storm passed before dark, and the air cooled with it. That night, at supper, Zadie sat in her usual place. Conversation hummed around her, but she didn't drift from it like she used to. When Lawson passed her the bread, their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. Later, she lingered outside the kitchen, drying her hands on her skirt. Lawson came by without speaking, just reached for hers and held it a breath longer than he needed to. Then he let go, and she watched him go, her fingers still warm. A week before the 4th of July, the Rossing Ranch prepared for the cattle drive north. The hands worked from first light, sorting the herd, repairing bridles, boiling coffee thick enough to carry them through the long trail days ahead. Zadie stayed close to the house, helping Myra salt the last of the pork shoulders and sew up canvas sacks for the chuck wagon. Though she wouldn't ride with them, the work carried a hush of anticipation, as if even the walls knew the rhythm was about to shift. Lawson had taken to sleeping in the hayloft, closer to the horses he'd be driving. He moved through the days with a quiet urgency, checking gear twice, oiling his saddle in the last of the evening light. Zadie noticed the change in him, not worry, but a steadiness, like he was bracing against something he'd known too well before. On the third morning, while the others loaded supplies, Lawson found her bent over a crate of dry goods behind the kitchen. "You ever been north of Prescott?" he asked. She glanced up, brushing flour from her knuckles. "No, it's different country. Cooler nights. Pines thicker than the sky." Zadie folded the sack she'd been tying. "Sounds like it'd be quiet. Quieter than here." She didn't speak right away, tracing the edge of the crate with one finger. "How long will you be gone?" 3 weeks. Maybe a few days more, if the river's high." She nodded once. "I'll keep your tools dry." He smiled at that, then stepped forward and offered her something wrapped in oilskin. She hesitated before taking it. Inside was a small leather-bound journal, the kind that could fit in a coat pocket. "I found it in town," he said. "Figured you might have things worth writing down." She turned it in her hands, the pages blank and smelling faintly of ink. "I've never written anything." "Doesn't mean you shouldn't." She looked up, and his expression held no expectation, just a quiet kind of hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady. That night, Rossing called the hands in early and fed them steak and beans under the open sky. The long table had been dragged outside, lit by lanterns hung from fence posts. Zadie sat in her usual seat, the journal tucked beneath her apron. Around her, the men laughed over old stories and traded guesses about weather and trail markers. Lawson sat across from her this time. When she passed him the butter, their eyes met, and something passed between them that didn't need naming. He didn't ask for anything. He simply looked at her like she had something in her worth waiting for. After the meal, she found herself walking alongside him toward the barn. The sky was deep with stars, the air smelling of sage and saddle soap. He carried his bedroll over one shoulder, a coil of rope in his free hand. "You ever think about leaving this place?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not anymore." He nodded, satisfied. At the barn door, he paused. "When I get back, I'd like to show you the ridge. The place I've been clearing." She took a breath. "I'd like that." He stepped closer, just enough to see the starlight catch in her eyes. "You don't have to speak if you don't want to." "I'll know." She let her hand rest on his coat sleeve. "I want to." Then he leaned down and kissed her gentle, like a promise made without rush. Her hands didn't tremble. She was not afraid. When he pulled back, she touched the edge of his collar and said, "Come back safe." "I will." At dawn, the cattle moved out in a slow, rumbling tide. Zadie stood beside Myra on the porch, watching the dust rise as the herd passed through the east gate. Lawson tipped his hat once, just before he disappeared into the heat shimmer. The days that followed were long and dry. Zadie kept busy with chores and began writing in the journal, just a few lines each night. She didn't write about Lawson, not directly, but his presence threaded between the words like a current she couldn't name. One evening, Ruth sat sewing by the fire while Zadie swept the corner near the hearth. The children were asleep in the next room. "You've changed," Ruth said, not unkindly. Zadie set the broom aside. "I don't know what you mean. You walk like someone who knows where she's going." Zadie looked at the fire, then back to her. "Maybe I do." On the morning of the 19th day, the first rider returned. Not Lawson, but a younger hand with a cracked lip and a sunburned neck. He brought word that the herd had crossed safely and the others were 2 days behind. No trouble, just slow water. Zadie pressed her palms to the kitchen table, steadying herself. Then she went to the barn and straightened Lawson's tools. 2 days later, just after supper, the yard filled with hooves and tired voices. The men rode in one by one, shoulders sagging, horses lathered. Lawson came last, dusty but whole. He didn't speak right away. Just walked up the porch steps and found her waiting by the door. She stepped forward, reached for his hand. "You're late," she said. He smiled down at her, eyes warm. "Told you I'd come back." She nodded. "I never doubted it." He leaned close, his forehead touching hers. "I cleared the ridge. I'll bring the bread." And just like that, the future unfolded quiet and certain, like the path had been there all along. The first night in Lawson's cabin came with no ceremony. He finished the roof just before the frost settled into the ground, and Zadie brought the last loaf of rye bread wrapped in a towel, still warm from the kitchen oven. She didn't ask if he was ready. He didn't ask if she was sure. They both knew. The cabin stood at the edge of the north ridge, overlooking a wide basin dotted with juniper and low sage. It held one room, a small stone hearth, and a cot Lawson had built with his own hands, layered thick with woolen down. The walls smelled faintly of pine pitch, and the shutters creaked in the wind. Zadie set the bread on the shelf near the stove, then turned to take it all in. "You built the table too?" she asked, running a hand along its edge. He nodded, unlacing his boots near the door. "From the same cedar I trimmed for the porch. Took a while to plane it smooth. It's good work." He crossed the room, brushing sawdust from his shirt. "I wanted it ready before the cold came." She turned toward him. "You knew I'd come?" "I was hoping." She touched the windowsill, quiet a moment. "I'm not bringing much." He reached for her hand, rough palm closing over her fingers. "You're bringing yourself. That's everything." They lived slow after that. Days shaped by the sun's rise and fall, by water to haul and fences to mend. Zadie took to the soil, coaxing onions and winter greens from the rocky earth behind the cabin. Lawson carved spoons and handles when the weather kept them inside. They read by firelight, the journal now half filled with her careful handwriting, though she never let him read it yet. One morning, she found him fitting a new latch to the door. "You expect someone to come through uninvited?" she teased, brushing flour from her skirt. He straightened, sun on his brow. "No, just want the wind to stay out." She stepped onto the porch, arms folded against the chill. "I used to think quiet meant emptiness. Loneliness. What does it mean now?" She looked out toward the basin, where 3 deer moved slowly through the brush. "It means peace." He nodded once. "Then I'll keep building it with you." That night, the wind came hard down the ridge, rattling the shutters and whistling through the eaves. Lawson rose once to stoke the fire, then came back to bed, pulling the quilt higher over them both. Zadie reached for his hand under the covers. "Did you ever think we'd have this?" He turned toward her in the dark. "I didn't let myself." "Why not?" "Because it felt too far to reach. And you were always quiet, like a song you couldn't quite catch." She pressed her forehead to his chest. "I was just waiting for someone to listen." They rose before dawn the next day, as always. She kneaded dough while he split kindling, the rhythm of their morning shaped by habit and ease. When she brought him coffee, he took it with a nod and a kiss to her temple, then returned to work. By early spring, the garden rose had sprouted green tips, and the sky lingered longer each evening. They rarely spoke of the past. It lived behind them, like the road down to the main house still there, but no longer leading where they needed to go. One afternoon, Lawson returned from the creek with his boots soaked and a string of fresh trout. Zadie met him at the porch, shaking her head at the state of him. "You fell in." "I stepped poorly." "You'll catch a chill. Then warm me." She laughed soft and full and took the fish from his hand. "Build the fire." "I'll dress them." He paused, watching her with that same look he'd given her that first supper, like she'd said something sacred just by speaking at all. "You still look at me like that," she said, gutting the first trout. "Like what?" "Like I might vanish." He crouched beside her, hands resting on his knees. "I look at you like I'm still learning how lucky I am." She didn't answer, just passed him the cleaned fish and leaned against him a moment longer than needed. That night, they ate by lantern light, the trout crisped over coals, the bread dense and perfect. When Lawson reached across the table to refill her cup, their fingers met, and neither moved away. The wind had quieted by then. The shutters stayed still. And in the hush of the evening, Zadie Greenwood, once told not to speak, held her place at the table without question. Lawson Reed looked her way, as he always had. But now, she looked back with no fear, no doubt. Only the knowledge of a life built true, steady as the ground beneath them. The last frost clung longer than expected, delaying the planting of beans and summer squash. Zadie paced the garden path, shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching the clouds hang low over the ridge like a held breath. Lawson stood near the fence, sharpening a draw-knife against the whetstone, the rasp of steel steady and sure. "You think we'll get enough rain this year?" she asked, rubbing her arms. He didn't look up. "If we don't, the creek will run shallow by July." She stepped closer, her boots brushing through the damp soil. "I've been thinking we should build another barrel. Catch more from the roof runoff." "Good thought," he said, pausing the blade. "We can use the slats from the broken trough out back." Zadie nodded and looked toward the ridge, where the first green buds had begun to push through the trees. "I want to try potatoes this year. If we're staying through the cold again." "We are." She glanced at him. "You sound sure." He wiped the knife clean and set it down. "I never planned to leave. And you haven't asked to." "I don't plan to." He crossed the yard in 3 strides, stopping before her. "Then let's build the kind of place that can hold us both through every season." She reached up, resting her fingers against the collar of his shirt. "We already are." That spring, they added a second rain barrel and dug a root cellar by hand. Lawson built a lean-to for the goats they'd traded for in town, and Zadie bartered extra loaves for hens from Ruth, who had moved to a property closer to her sisters. Ruth came by once in May, bringing her 2 children and a sack of dried apples. "You've done well," she said, watching Zadie stir a pot of stew over the fire. Zadie ladled out a bowl and handed it to her. "It's not perfect." Ruth smiled. "You wouldn't want it if it was." That night, after Ruth and the children left, Zadie sat on the porch steps, her apron dusted with flour, her eyes soft with thought. Lawson joined her, wiping his hands on a rag. "She looked happy," he said. "She is. They're safe." He sat beside her. "You helped with that." Zadie leaned her head against his shoulder. "I've been thinking about something." He waited. "I want to marry you," she said. Lawson stilled, then turned his head just slightly. "You're sure?" "I'm not afraid anymore. Not of being seen. Not of being loved." He took her hand, folding it into his. "I was going to ask once the cellar was finished." "I beat you to it." "You did." They married beneath the cottonwood tree 2 weeks later. No preacher, just Myra, who'd ridden up from the ranch, and Rossing, who brought a Bible and a stubborn mule. Ruth came too, with her children holding hands and solemn faces. Zadie wore a dress she'd sewn herself, pale blue with lace at the sleeves. Lawson had trimmed his beard and wore the same coat he'd worn the day he returned from the cattle drive. When Myra asked if they had vows, Zadie only said, "I choose him." Lawson answered, "Every day." They signed their names in the family Bible, and Myra blessed their union with a firm nod and a slice of apple cake. Later, after the guests had gone and the mule's braying faded into dusk, they stood alone inside the cabin. The fire crackled low. Zadie ran her fingers across the table edge, now worn smooth with time. "We've got everything we need right here," she said. He came to her side, pressing his palm to her back. "And room enough to grow." That summer, the rains came late but strong. The potatoes took, and the hens laid regular. Zadie's journal filled, page after page, with recipes, planting charts, and lines of poetry she didn't read aloud. Lawson carved her a new stool for the kitchen, and she embroidered his initials into the corner of their quilt. By the time the first frost returned, they had a baby on the way. She told him one morning while he was hitching the cart. He stopped mid-buckle, turned to her slow. She placed his hand over her belly, still flat beneath her apron. He didn't speak, just rested his forehead against hers and closed his eyes. They spent the winter close, firewood stacked high, stews thick with root vegetables. Lawson read aloud by lamplight, his voice steady and low. Zadie stitched tiny shirts and hummed softly beneath her breath, a sound that filled the cabin like light through the shutters. When spring came again, it brought with it a daughter. Born just after dawn, her hair dark and her grip strong. They named her Clara, after Zadie's mother, and she slept tucked between them the first few nights, her breathing steady and soft. Zadie held her close one evening, rocking slow near the hearth. "She's got your eyes," Lawson said, crouching beside them. "She's got your calm," Zadie replied. Outside, the wind swept through the junipers, but inside, the world was still. They had built it steady, this life. Not rushed, not easy, but true. And in that cabin on the ridge, with the fire low and the night wrapped close, Zadie Greenwood and Lawson Reed rested in the peace they'd made with each other, with the land, and with the quiet that no longer meant loneliness, but love.